In 1948, railroad executives laughed off the Pennsylvania Railroad's radical new diesel, branding its brutal, shark-like nose as too ugly to sell. Yet in just a few years, this rejected experiment would become the most in-demand locomotive in America, rewriting industry standards almost overnight. How did a design so widely ridiculed transform into an icon? And what happened inside the boardrooms that made it possible? The answer begins with shock and defiance. The first public glimpses of Baldwin's new diesel left railroad insiders and reporters stunned. In 1948, at Baldwin's Eddystone Works, the locomotive's nose seemed to slice through every expectation of what a modern diesel should look like. The front end was sharply pointed, prow-like, almost predatory, nothing like the rounded, familiar faces of EMD's F units, or even Baldwin's own earlier babyface designs. The press struggled for words, calling it aggressive, radical, and unconventional. Some compared it to an armored tank, others to a creature of the deep. The trade journal Railway Age described the styling as a bold attempt to distance Baldwin's diesels from their mechanically troubled past. Industry veterans whispered that the new look was a gamble, a break from the boxy, conservative lines dominating American railroads. At Altoona, Pennsylvania, where the Pennsylvania Railroad staged its own unveiling, visiting executives and engineers studied the sharp angles and recessed headlight with a mix of fascination and disbelief. The nickname sharknose did not appear in official brochures, but the shape inspired a wave of railfan commentary that would stick for generations. For many in the industry, the shock was immediate and visceral. Some called it too modern for its own good. Others muttered that it was simply too much, a design that would never win over the men who signed the checks. A few reporters, searching for metaphors, likened the nose to a warship's prow or the snout of a predatory fish. The contrast with EMD's familiar rounded cab units was stark, where EMD looked friendly and approachable. Baldwin's new machine looked ready for a fight. Photographs from the 1948 and 1950 unveilings ran in railway magazines across the country. Side by side, the new Baldwin made its competition look timid, almost old-fashioned. Trade publications ran headlines that played up the controversy. Letters to the editor poured in. Some readers praised the boldness, hinting that American railroading needed a jolt. Others dismissed the look as a passing fad, a mistake that would fade as quickly as it appeared. The Pennsylvania Railroad's own publicity team seemed caught off guard by the intensity of the reaction. Their press releases emphasized power, speed, and reliability, barely mentioning the nose at all. But the conversation had already moved beyond technical specs. In boardrooms and roundhouses, the question was not just whether the locomotive could pull tonnage, it was whether anyone would want to be seen running it. The stage was set for a battle between tradition and ambition, with the sharknose as the lightning rod for every opinion in the industry. Inside the Pennsylvania Railroad's executive suites, the debate was relentless. The sharknose's appearance stirred every instinct for caution among the old guard. Yet the numbers on the procurement sheets told a different story. Baldwin's bid for the new diesels offered a lower per-unit cost than EMD, and the technical proposals promised more horsepower, 1,600 per unit, compared to 1,500 from the competition. For a railroad moving millions of tons of coal over the Alleghenies, every bit of power translated into fewer engines per train and lower crew costs. The boardroom arguments circled around more than just price. Memories of Baldwin's earlier baby-face diesels, which had left maintenance crews grumbling and shop time climbing, weighed heavily. But the sharknose proposal claimed those problems were behind them. The prime mover was a refined 608A engine, supposedly debugged after years of headaches. Baldwin's engineers pointed to design changes, improved wiring, modular components for faster repairs, and a body shell that drew on the aerodynamic lessons of the T1 steam locomotive. The sloped nose was not just for show. It promised better airflow for cooling and reduced drag at speed. Some directors still bristled at the idea of fielding a fleet that looked nothing like the familiar EMD models. Letters from other railroads hinted that the styling might be a liability with the public. But the Pennsylvania Railroad's traffic department was blunt. What mattered was tonnage moved, not looks. The sharknose offered superior tractive effort at low speeds, a clear advantage for the coal drags that defined Pensie's bread and butter. Internal memos from the mechanical department underscored the need for engines that could pull harder and last longer between overhauls. The existing EMD fleet, while reliable, struggled on the steepest grades without extra units. The decision became a test of nerve. Approving the order meant betting millions that Baldwin's promises would hold up in real-world service. If the sharknose failed, the cost would be measured not just in dollars, but in lost time, damaged reputation, and yet another round of costly retooling. But if it worked, the Pennsylvania Railroad would gain an edge in both efficiency and operating cost, at a moment when dieselization was reshaping the industry. After weeks of deliberation, the board authorized the initial purchase, a fleet large enough to prove or disprove Baldwin's claims. The order included 22 A units and 22 B units of the new sharknose freight locomotives, with an option for more if performance justified the risk. The styling, inspired by the T1's prow, was accepted as a necessary departure, a calculated risk in pursuit of a technical advantage. Raymond Loewy's influence lingered in the silhouette, but the final form was the work of Baldwin's own engineering team, shaped as much by internal constraints as by any designer's vision. The gamble was set. The sharknose would have to earn its place on the rails, not in the showroom. For the Pennsylvania Railroad, the next chapter would be written not in the boardroom, but on the test track and in the daily grind of mainline service. Baldwin's engineering team approached the sharknose with a clear purpose. Every angle, every surface, every internal layout was shaped by the demands of the railroad, not by fashion. The pointed prow, often the target of jokes, was a calculated answer to two persistent problems: air flow and visibility. At speed, traditional boxy cabs created turbulence that robbed locomotives of cooling efficiency, especially on long, heavy trains through tunnels and mountain grades. The sloped nose of the sharknose managed the airflow, channeling it smoothly across the radiator intakes and around the body. This was not just about style. It was about keeping temperatures in check on hard climbs over the Alleghenies, where overheating could stall a coal drag for hours. Visibility was another quiet revolution. Earlier Baldwin designs, like the so-called baby-face units, had wide, rounded noses that forced engineers to peer around blind spots. The sharknose's prow, by contrast, narrowed toward the center line, pulling the windshield forward and down. This gave crews a clearer view of the track ahead, especially at grade crossings and in yards crowded with switching moves. The split windshield and raked jawline were not just for effect. They were the result of repeated feedback from test crews and shopmen who wanted better sight lines without sacrificing strength. Inside the cab, Baldwin's modular approach paid off in ways that went mostly unnoticed by the public. Key systems, wiring harnesses, electrical panels, even the massive 608A prime mover were designed for easier access. Maintenance crews could swap out components without wrestling with a tangle of wires or crawling through cramped compartments. The body shell itself, though dramatic from the outside, was engineered for quick removal, allowing mechanics to reach vital equipment in the field. This focus on modularity meant less downtime, a critical factor for railroads trying to keep trains moving and costs down. The sharknose also carried forward lessons learned from the Pennsylvania Railroad's own T1 steam locomotives. The T1's streamlined casing, had proven that smart airflow management could make a difference, even at the relatively modest speeds of American freight service. Baldwin's engineers took that lesson to heart, adapting it to a diesel platform where cooling and reliability mattered more than pure speed. The result was a locomotive that looked like nothing else on the rails but delivered tangible, measurable benefits in day-to-day operation. For all the talk about its looks, the Sharknose was a machine built from the inside out. Its shape followed the logic of airflow, crew comfort, and mechanical access, not the whims of the market. As the first units rolled out of Eddystone, the men who ran and repaired them started to see past the silhouette. They found a locomotive that worked with them, not against them, a machine whose radical form was rooted in the hard realities of the railroad business. The numbers would soon tell their own story, but even before the first test run, the engineering behind the Sharknose was already rewriting the rules of what a diesel could be. On the test tracks at Altoona, numbers, not opinions, began to settle the argument. The Sharknose rolled out with a factory rating of 1,600 horsepower per unit, edging out the EMDF7's 1,500. But raw horsepower only told part of the story. In real freight service, what mattered most was tractive effort, the force that actually moved tons of coal up the Allegheny grades. Starting tests measured the Baldwin at roughly 64,000 pounds of pull, matching or slightly topping its EMD rival. Engineers noted that the Sharknose could hold this force at low speeds, a vital trait for coal drags and heavy manifest freights. Fuel efficiency, always a concern for the bean counters, showed another advantage. Road trials and PRR internal reports pointed to a 5 to 10% fuel savings in typical drag service compared to the F7. That margin meant thousands of gallons per year across a large fleet, especially on long runs where every bit of economy counted. The modular engine layout and improved cooling kept maintenance hours down, and crews reported fewer unscheduled stops for overheating or electrical faults. On paper, the Sharknose and the EMDF7 looked evenly matched. In practice, the Sharknose's continuous rating, its ability to deliver full power hour after hour, gave it an edge in the toughest assignments. PRR's own logs recorded fewer double-heading requirements on heavy trains, and the Sharknose's reputation for lugging grew with every successful run. Test engineers, once skeptical, began to speak of the Baldwin as a genuine workhorse, not just a bold experiment. The numbers made their way from the test labs to the boardroom. Procurement officers saw that for the same money, they could move more tonnage with less fuel and less downtime. The Sharknose wasn't just a stylistic gamble. It was a practical solution backed by hard data. Rival railroads took notice as performance figures circulated through industry journals and word of mouth among operating crews. The doubts that had dogged the Sharknose from its first unveiling began to fade. On the basis of horsepower, tractive effort, and fuel economy, Baldwin's controversial design had proven its worth. The numbers spoke for themselves, and the market was about to respond. Order sheets began piling up at Baldwin's Eddystone plant faster than anyone had predicted. The Pennsylvania Railroad's initial commitment, 22 A units and 22 B units, sent a clear message to the industry that performance trumped appearances. Within a year, competitors who had dismissed the Sharknose as a visual oddity found themselves rethinking their strategies. The Baltimore and Ohio, long loyal to EMD, placed orders for 30 RF-16s in 1951, seeking to close the gap in coal hauling power. New York Central, not to be outdone, signed up for 14 A units, adding their name to the growing list of buyers. By 1953, Baldwin had produced 109 A units and 51 B units, 160 locomotives in total that bore the unmistakable prow. For a builder that had struggled to break EMD's grip on the market, this was a breakthrough. The Sharknose grabbed nearly 10% of new U.S. freight diesel orders during its short production run. a remarkable feat against the tide of standardization sweeping the industry. Railroad executives who had once scoffed at the design now scrambled to secure delivery slots. Internal memos from the era reveal a sense of urgency. Roads that hesitated risked being left with backlogged orders or forced to settle for less capable models. Baldwin's assembly lines ran at capacity, turning out units for the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, New York Central, and a handful of smaller lines. The sharknose, once a punch line, had become a hot commodity. For the first time since the war, Baldwin's order books looked healthy, and the company's engineers watched as their radical creation took over mainline freights from the Alleghenies to the Midwest. The numbers did not just silence the critics. They started a race that changed the market. Long after the last sharknose rolled out of Eddystone, its image lingered across American culture. Pennsylvania Railroad's ad campaigns in the early 1950s presented the locomotive as a sign of progress, splashing its sharp profile across posters and magazine spreads. The pointed prow, once dismissed as outlandish, became the face of modern railroading in toy catalogs and living rooms. Lionel, the country's most popular model train maker, produced tens of thousands of sharknose replicas. Children who had never seen a real coal drag on the Alleghenies lined up tracks in their basements, running miniature versions of the same locomotive that once divided the industry. The sharknose's influence extended beyond nostalgia. Railroad museums from Pennsylvania to the Midwest have preserved two original units, their distinctive noses now polished and displayed as artifacts of post-war ambition. Curators and historians point to these engines as proof that public taste can change and that yesterday's oddity can become tomorrow's icon. For many, the sharknose is more than a machine. It is a symbol of an era when railroads dared to challenge convention. The locomotive's legacy shaped how railroads evaluated new designs. After the sharknose, procurement shifted away from conservative styling toward a focus on measurable performance. The lesson was clear. Function could define beauty, and risk could pay off in ways no one expected. Even now, modelers, writers, and fans keep the sharknose alive, not just as a relic, but as a reminder that the boldest ideas often leave the deepest mark. Today, design that dares to break the mold still sparks controversy and also progress. The sharknose proved that true innovation often starts at the edge of ridicule. In rail yards and boardrooms alike, performance now outranks appearances, a shift that began with these so-called ugly engines. The lesson endures. Challenge the standard, and you just might set the next one. What risks are we still too afraid to take?